Hostel camps are meant to be fun, bonfires, ghost stories, and late-night adventures. But what if one of those stories was real? Tonight, I bring you a chilling tale of a hostel camp where a harmless trip turned into a nightmare no one would ever forget. A true horror story from someone who barely made it out alive. It was the summer of 2018. A group of college students, including Rahul, Maya, Ankit, and their friends, had come to a remote hostel camp in the mountains of Himachal Pradesh. The place was surrounded by thick pine forests, far away from civilization. It was meant to be a peaceful retreat. No cell service, no city noise, just the sounds of nature and the thrill of adventure. The hostel itself was old, a two-story wooden structure with peeling paint and creaky floors. The caretaker, an elderly man named Raghu, welcomed them with a strange warning. Stay inside after dark. The forest is not safe at night. The students laughed it off, assuming it was just an attempt to scare them. Little did they know, Raghu was deadly serious. That first night, they gathered around a bonfire outside, telling horror stories and roasting marshmallows. The laughter echoed through the trees, but something felt off. Maya was the first to notice it. The wind had stopped. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were gone. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. Then came the whispering, faint at first, but growing louder. It seemed to come from the trees, hushed voices speaking in a language none of them recognized. Ankit turned to Rahul, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" Before Rahul could answer, the fire flickered violently, as if something had rushed past it. Disturbed but trying to shake it off, they returned to the hostel. But that night, one of them disappeared. Ravi, the quietest of the group, had gone to the washroom before bed. When morning came, his bed was empty, his bag untouched. His phone was still charging beside his bed. There was no sign of him. Panic set in. The group searched the entire hostel and the nearby forest, calling his name. No footprints, no struggle, nothing. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. The caretaker, Raghu, sighed heavily when he heard the news. "It has begun," he muttered, his eyes filled with something that looked like fear. That night, Maya had a dream, or at least she thought it was a dream. She woke up to the sound of whispers again, but this time they were inside the room. Frozen in fear, she turned toward the mirror on the wall and saw something impossible. Her reflection was smiling, but she wasn't. The reflection slowly raised a hand and pointed behind her. Trembling, Maya turned and saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. It had no eyes, no mouth, just a featureless face and elongated limbs. It stood there for only a moment before vanishing. That was the final straw. The group decided to leave immediately. They packed their bags in silence, their faces pale and hollow-eyed from the terror they had experienced. But as they stepped outside, the forest seemed different. The path they had taken before was gone. Trees loomed over them, twisting unnaturally. It was as if the forest itself was alive, trapping them within its grasp. Then the whispers returned, louder this time, almost deafening. The air grew colder and a thick mist rolled in, making it impossible to see. Panic set in. They ran blindly, their footsteps muffled by the dense fog. One by one, they tripped, fell, screamed, and then silence. The hostel was later shut down, deemed unsafe due to mysterious disappearances. No one knows what really happened that night. Some say it was just hysteria. Others believe something far more sinister lurked in those woods. But one thing is certain, none of them were ever the same again. So if you ever find yourself in an old hostel deep in the forest, and you hear whispers in the night, run before it's too late. In the summer of 2017, a group of university students from London decided to take a short trip to the countryside. Their hostel had organised a weekend camping experience in a remote area of the Scottish Highlands. It was meant to be a peaceful retreat. No Wi-Fi, no distractions, just the beauty of nature. There were 12 students in total, including James, Emily, Tom and Rachel. They were excited, taking pictures and discussing all the fun they had planned. Bonfires, ghost stories, and maybe even a late-night hike. The bus ride was long, and as they left the city behind, the landscape became wilder, the roads narrower. By the time they arrived, the sun was already setting. The hostel was different from what they expected. It was a large but aging wooden building, standing alone at the edge of a dense forest. There were no other buildings nearby, no cell phone reception, and the only sign of life was the hostel's caretaker, a quiet man named Mr. Hughes. "Stick to the paths and don't go into the forest at night," he told them as he handed over the keys. His tone wasn't friendly, nor was it meant to be a joke. But the students, of course, laughed it off. That first night, they sat outside around a bonfire, telling horror stories and roasting marshmallows. The air was crisp, the sky filled with stars. But as the night deepened, something changed. The wind died down. The usual sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant owls, went silent. Then came the knocking, a faint rhythmic tap, 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 coming from the trees. It was soft at first, almost like an animal moving through the underbrush. But then it grew louder, closer, until it sounded like it was coming from right behind them. James stood up, shining his flashlight into the trees. "Probably just the wind," he said. But the trees didn't move. There was no wind. They returned to the hostel, brushing off the strange sounds as their imagination playing tricks on them. But by morning, one of them was missing. Tom's bed was empty. His backpack was still in the room, his phone still charging beside his bed. But he was gone. Panic set in. They searched everywhere. The hostel, the forest, even the small dirt road leading back to town. But there was no sign of him. No footprints, no struggle, nothing. It was as if he had simply disappeared into thin air. They told Mr. Hughes, who didn't seem surprised. "The forest takes those who don't listen," was all he said before walking away. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She kept hearing noises, soft whispers, like voices carried on the wind. At 2 a.m., she decided to check outside. That's when she saw it. Just beyond the edge of the forest, something was moving. Not walking, drifting. A shadowy figure, too tall and too thin to be human. It had no face, no defining features, just a dark, shifting mass. And then, it turned toward her. Her scream woke the others. When they rushed outside, the figure was gone. But on the ground, right where it had been standing, were Tom's shoes, perfectly placed, side by side, grabbed their bags, and left, ignoring Mr. Hughes's protests. They ran down the dirt road, the early morning fog thick around them. When they finally reached the nearest town, exhausted and terrified, they reported Tom's disappearance. The authorities searched the hostel and the surrounding forest for days, but Tom was never found. No trace, no signs of struggle, just an empty bed and a pair of shoes left behind. The hostel was shut down a year later due to safety concerns. But the locals still tell stories of strange whispers in the forest, of people who vanish without a trace, and of something watching. So if you ever find yourself in an old hostel deep in the forest, and you hear whispers in the night, don't look, don't stop, and whatever you do, don't go missing. If you enjoyed this terrifying story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more horror tales. Stay safe, and remember, some places should be left alone.